So how often have you heard the phrase, the thought expressed, how recently even, the idea that I need more faith? I wish my faith were bigger, and maybe you've heard someone else, maybe it's been you. If only I had more faith. You know, if my faith were bigger, stronger, something like that. And on the one hand, it's a great goal. It's a pursuit. You know, we think, my life would be different. I'd be experiencing more of God's power in some way if I had more faith, bigger faith. And so it's a good goal, but I want us to stop and think for a minute, is it really the right question? Is that the problem, that our faith isn't big enough? That we don't have enough faith? Because I don't think it is. Again, I certainly think this goal of wanting to experience God and His power, that's a great goal. But so often I hear people talk about that. Well, the way to do it, if I just had more faith. And I don't believe that's what the Bible shows is the issue. And certainly as we look at Matthew 17 today, how big is my faith? How much faith? That's not the question. And so the central question today, the thing I want us to focus on, what is the real problem when it comes to faith? What is the real thing? Again, there is something that needs to change, needs to be different, but what is it? Leading up to this, again, we're in Matthew 17. Prior to this, you have these disciples of Jesus, this inner group, this inner circle, and they weren't really aware of the nature of the kingdom. Not just really, they weren't aware of it at all. They knew a Messiah was coming, and they expected there's going to be this physical kingdom, and as part of that, this glorious kingdom for the Jews. And so the Messiah is going to reign in Israel on the throne of David, literally, and that was their expectation. Well, they weren't aware of the nature of the kingdom up until recently. And Jesus, you remember, Peter, he asked, who do the people say I am? Peter said, you're the Messiah. You're the one we've been waiting for, and you're even the Son of God. There's something about you we weren't expecting, some connection to God. And then after that, it says Jesus began to tell them, I'm going to suffer and die and be raised again. And the first time he says it, Peter rebukes him. So they weren't aware of the nature of the kingdom, but then things shift with that. Now they're not accepting the nature of the kingdom. And basically chapter 17 is God's way of saying not accepting what I tell you is not acceptable. And he's going to make that clear. And it starts with what's commonly known as the transfiguration. So let's look. Matthew 17, starting at verse 1, it says, after 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John, the brother of James, and led them up to a high mountain by themselves. Now, a couple things there. Peter, James, and John, they, at times, again, you have this group of 12 disciples, and then you have this inner circle of 3, and there's some things they get to experience that the others don't. The transfiguration, certain healings, the Garden of Gethsemane, they go closer. And so there was this inner circle. The thing that starts off there is Matthew says after 6 days. Matthew doesn't usually give the exact count, does he? You remember how he'll just say then, he'll say after that. And it seems like he'll even rearrange things, from chronologically to thematically. And he wants you to know this follows thematically. Not necessarily right away, but keep in mind what you just saw so you can understand this. Well, here he says after 6 days. Well, 6 days after what? If you flip back up to the chapter before, it's what I just talked about. Jesus asked, who do the people say I am? Peter, speaking for all the disciples, you're the Christ, the Messiah, the Son of the living God. But then also where Jesus says, I'm going to Jerusalem to die, and Peter rebukes him. That just doesn't fit the expectation at all. 6 days after that. And so God's intention with doing this, and Matthew's with writing it, is realize that's fresh on their mind. This is in response to that. Jesus led them up to a high mountain by themselves. Then he was transfigured before them. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became as white as the light. Transfigured, this glory that Jesus has as God himself, that isn't, he didn't walk around like this all the time, his face glowing. You see the old pictures, and, he'll have a little halo above his head, and, the disciples, they've got their own little, mini halos, and that wasn't the case. You couldn't look at Jesus and say, wow, you must be, you just tell by looking, no. But here it was. That's what the point of this was. Some of that glory, not all of it, because we can't see that and live, but some of it comes out. His face shone like the sun, sort of reminiscent of Moses after he was on the mountain. And if you want to go through here, there's a lot of parallels, really, to Moses on the mountain to get the law, the Ten Commandments and the law. And Jesus' clothes became as white as the light. Just then there appeared before them Moses and Elijah talking with Jesus. So it's not just Jesus anymore, it's two of the greatest heroes of the Old Testament, Moses and Elijah. And when you take those that already in and of themselves, they're big names, but they're representative. You know, often Jesus will talk about the Old Testament, and what will he call it? The law and the prophets. The law and the prophets speak. The law and the prophets say, well, Moses is the one who gave the law, and Elijah is probably the best known prophet. That's what they represent. The law and the prophets are there in the form of Moses and Elijah, and they're talking with Jesus. Talking with Jesus. Imagine that. To be able to hear Moses and Elijah and Jesus just talk about stuff. What do you think they talked about? I know. I don't know that Jesus was asking them about their life because he was aware, but maybe they're asking him some things. What are they aware of from heaven looking down? They're the ones that gave these prophecies that spoke forward about the Messiah. And now to see it, realize here's the Messiah. I don't know, but how amazing that would be. And Peter's feeling the same way we can imagine. Verse 4, Peter said to Jesus, Lord, it is good for us to be here. This is awesome, he's saying. If you wish, I will put up 3 shelters. One for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. Now, people often say Peter's guilty of speaking before he thinks. He did think. He thought, this is the most amazing thing a Jew could ever experience. Have you ever been asked the question, if you could talk with anyone from history, and we always say, who would I talk to? And this is who they'd pick. Moses, Elijah. Again, they'd be right at the top of the list, and they're talking to the Messiah. This was the most incredible thing a Jew could imagine. And so Peter says, let me put up, and it says in the NIV, 3 shelters. Some translations say tents, others say tabernacles. What they were these tent tabernacle shelters that they would build, these booths at times they're called that they would build and live in, similar to what they lived in the wilderness. And now they had the feast of the tabernacles. And so they would build these things and live in them for like 7 days. And so a little lean-to, a little something like that. Peter's basically saying, let me do something to prolong this experience. Let's keep this going a few days. We'll just sit and listen to you guys. This is amazing. Peter is missing the point, though. You can understand why he'd want to do that, but he's missing the point. And God makes it clear, verse 5, while he was still speaking, God interrupts Peter. You have to, I know, how rude of God to do that, but you have to, again, Peter didn't just say those few words. You have to imagine he's going on and on. I'll do this, I'll put this one here, and Moses will give a desert team because he was used to that, and Elijah will do the whole chariots, and, I'll just have this perfect, Jesus, let me set it up. And while he was speaking, a bright cloud covered them, and a voice from the cloud said, this is my son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him. Now you go back and look in Matthew chapter 3, and it's the exact thing Jesus said, or God said from that cloud when Jesus was baptized, except he adds that last phrase, listen to him. So he repeats that and adds, listen to him. Well, when his disciples heard this, they fell face down to the ground terrified. None of you are face down on the ground terrified. I just said the same words that I quoted it there. No cloud. No cloud. That must be it. There's no cloud. So it's not the words, it's the cloud. I just want you to realize, maybe it's the deep voice. Maybe if I'd said it like this. It's still. But I want us to realize, again, we're reading this. Whatever it was, the sound of the voice, the cloud, they were terrified. They fell down on their faces on the ground. This just blew them away. And in a way, it wasn't just amazing, cool. It was like terrified. Stop and think about that. That's God speaking to them. But Jesus came and touched them. Get up, he said. Don't be afraid. When they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus. Moses and Elijah are gone. Jesus, the one who is the focal point of this, he remains. Verse 9, as they were coming down the mountain, Jesus instructed them, "Don't tell anyone what you've seen until the Son of Man has been raised from the dead." Wouldn't that suck? You've just experienced the greatest thing a Jew can imagine. Have you ever had that? Something great has happened and someone, yeah, don't tell anyone, please. Come on. Jesus says, don't tell anyone. And often Jesus would say to people, don't tell anyone. You ever stop and think, wasn't Jesus' whole purpose to tell people? I mean, that's why he came, was to let people know about him. And here he's got some help. Go, you're like, don't tell anyone. Because they aren't going to tell the right thing, remember? That Peter, even though they're starting to get it, Peter, James, and John, they tell about this, Moses and Elijah. Wow, the people are going to get worked up in the wrong direction. And Jesus says, don't tell them until after the Son of Man's been raised. And be raised means he had to die. Then things have become a little more clear. He says, you can tell them then. Well, that leads into verse 10. The disciples asked Jesus, "Why then do the teachers of the law say that Elijah must come first?" Jesus replied, "To be sure, Elijah comes and will restore all things, but I tell you, Elijah has already come, and they did not recognize him, but have done to him everything they wished. In the same way, the Son of Man is going to suffer at their hands." Then the disciples understood that he was talking to them about John the Baptist. Now, there's two issues here in that little section. The first one is, verse 13, the disciples understood he was talking about John the Baptist. Well, Jesus had already said back in chapter 11, verse 14, "And if you are willing to accept it, John is the Elijah who was to come." Well, why are they just getting it now? And we'll know exactly. It seems like maybe it wasn't totally clear what this coming of Elijah was going to be. Again, maybe so symbolic or figurative. I mean, they just saw Elijah up there, so well, maybe that was it. Maybe John was sort of it, maybe someone else is it, and that it, and it all combines to be it. And so, all right, you can sort of get that. But the other issue, the bigger issue, is verse 10. The disciples asked him, "Why then do the teachers of the law say Elijah must come first, before the Messiah?" Well, it's very clear in Malachi, so it's not like they're asking, why do the teachers say this at all? Because Malachi 4:5 says, "I will send the prophet Elijah to you before this great and dreadful day of the Lord." So they had this expectation the Messiah was going to come, and someone, in some sense, Elijah was going to precede him. The key here seems to be the word "then." Where it says, "Why then do the teachers of the law say?" And in some translations it says, "Then why?" And you can understand it. Someone's talking, Jesus is talking, and they're like, okay, then why do the teachers of the law say Elijah's going to come? Well, what is the thing that triggers that thought? What's the "then" refer to? And I think it's when Jesus says, "Don't tell anyone what you've seen until the Son of Man has been raised from the dead." Jesus is the Son of Man. He's the Messiah. If you're going to be raised from the dead, what's that mean? You're going to die. And I think that's what they're saying. Well, then why then do the teachers of the law say that Elijah's going to come? And they knew from the passage, Elijah's going to come and prepare for the Messiah. He's going to turn the hearts of the people. He's going to do all these things to prepare. If Elijah, in whatever sense he's coming, is going to get things ready for the Messiah, how's it going to get so screwed up that the Messiah dies? If he's preparing, why is it going to turn out like this, Jesus? And that's when Jesus tells them, to be sure, yeah, they're right, you're right, Elijah comes and will restore all things, but I tell you, Elijah's already come and they did not recognize him. John did have a ministry, and it was popular with the people, but not with the Jewish leaders, not with the nation as a whole. They didn't recognize him. They have done to him everything they wish, so that would include Herod as well. And the Jewish leaders, they were fine too that Herod arrested him. They didn't care for him. And then Jesus goes on, in the same way the Son of Man is going to suffer at their hands. So it is going to be the same. He did prepare. Look what happened to him. This is the nature of what it is. And then when it says the disciples understood that he was talking to them about John the Baptist, it seems like that understood has that sense of it started to sink in. Oh, just because Elijah's coming to prepare and the Messiah's coming, it's not going to be all glorious. It's not going to be just Israel's top of the world and everything's great for us. Things weren't great for the guy preparing for the Messiah. I guess they're not going to be great for the Messiah. It's starting to sink in what Jesus has been saying. Well then, verse 14, when they came to the crowd, a man approached Jesus and knelt before him. "Lord, have mercy on my son," he said. "He has seizures and is suffering greatly. He often falls into the fire or into the water. I brought him to your disciples, but they could not heal him." And Jesus says, "You unbelieving and perverse generation, how long shall I stay with you? How long shall I put up with you? Bring the boy here to me." Jesus rebuked the demon, and it came out of the boy, and he was healed at that moment. So they come down, and Jesus with his 3 disciples, Peter, James, and John, the other 9 disciples are down there. They've been healing people, and so this man brings his son to them. The son is demon-possessed, and the disciples try to cast out the demon, and it doesn't go out. They're not able to cast out the demon. And Jesus responds to that. Notice it's your disciples, but he says, "You unbelieving and perverse generation." So he's not just talking, he's talking to the disciples, but he's saying, you know what, the problem here is the problem with the whole generation. Israel, this nation as a whole. You unbelieving and perverse. And so unbelieving, it's not just like there's not enough evidence. Perverse, you're just not getting it. It's a moral problem, not an intellectual problem. And you disciples, you got the same issue everyone else has. And he says, "Bring the boy to me." He rebukes the demon, and look what it says. He healed him at that moment. You know, Jesus is showing there's nothing more difficult about this demon than any other demon. And that goes sort of in contrast to some of your Bibles will have a note around after verse 20 and say there's a verse 21 that we're not sure if it was in the original, and where Jesus says this kind only comes out through prayer and fasting. Again, your note will say it's not in the earliest manuscripts, and I just want to give a word. You know, don't let that ever undermine your confidence in the Bible. We know where these things are that are uncertain, so it's not like, we're not sure. And they're so minor. If this goes in the Bible, okay. If it's not in the Bible, it doesn't change our faith any. The vast majority of the Bible, 99%, especially of the New Testament, we know exactly what's there. And the parts that we're not sure about, like this, it really doesn't matter either way. But I definitely think that it's right to leave it off because it doesn't fit. Jesus didn't pray and fast to get this demon out. And there's no indication that Jesus had more power than the disciples, that his was above theirs. They were given power to raise the dead. They had as much power as he did. It wasn't that Jesus was able to do it without prayer and fasting, but you guys, you're going to have to pray and fast. No, he cast out the demon. And matter of fact, that's the same question. You go on, that's the question the disciples had. They come to him in verse 19 in private and asked, "Why couldn't we drive it out?" Notice they don't say, "Jesus, we understand this one was a little different. This one, he had some experience. This one's been around the block. We understand why we couldn't cast." No. They're like, "What's up? We've been casting out demons for a while, Jesus. Why can't we cast out this one?" And he replied, "Because you have so little faith." Sounds like the problem there is the size of their faith, doesn't it? The amount of their faith. Truly, I tell you, if you have faith as small as a mustard seed, you can say to the mountain, "Move from here to there," and it will move. Nothing will be impossible for you. Now, does that mean nothing will be impossible for you? Mm-hmm. Nothing can overthrow the plans of God. And we need to realize nothing within the will of God is impossible. Nothing God wants you to accomplish. Can you throw off God and become God? No, that would be impossible. But you wouldn't really have faith if you're trying to do that. And that's what we're going to see today as well. If you have true faith, then you're going to be wanting the things that God wants, and none of that will be impossible. Well, then he goes on, when they came together, verse 22, in Galilee, he said to them, "The Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men. They will kill him, and on the 3rd day he will be raised to life." And the disciples were filled with grief. It's the 3rd time he said, "I'm going to die and come back to life." The first time, Peter rebukes him. "Never, Lord, ain't going to happen." The second time we just saw above here, up in verse 9, he says it, and they ask a question like, "What's up? Why, if Elijah's coming to prepare, why are you dying?" And this time it says they're filled with grief. It's starting to sink in. They get it. They don't like it, but they get it. Verse 24, after Jesus and his disciples arrived in Capernaum, the collectors of the 2 drachma temple tax came to Peter and asked, "Doesn't your teacher pay the temple tax?" Taxes. Probably the last thing some of us want to hear about this time of year, but here it is, the temple tax. It's not prescribed in the Bible, but it was the habit, the Jews to pay this for the upkeep of the temple. And they say, "Doesn't your master pay it?" And verse 25, "Yes, he does," Peter replied. Notice what Peter didn't do there. He didn't ask Jesus, "Does your master pay the temple tax?" Well, of course he does. It says, when Peter came into the house then, Jesus was the first to speak. Why was Jesus the first to speak? I think Peter didn't want to speak up. He just committed Jesus to paying this tax. He didn't have it, obviously. He would have reached it. Yeah, of course he does. Here it is. You know, he spoke up. He does pay this tax. Hadn't really thought it. Hadn't asked Jesus. Jewish people, males, they paid this tax. Well, look what Peter says. What do you think, Simon? He asked. From whom do the kings of the earth collect duty and taxes? From their own children or from others? Again, temple tax, the king is God. Jesus is saying, all right, let's just think about this. When a king of the earth imposes a tax, does he tax his own child? No. Peter says there, 26, from others. Then the children are exempt, Jesus said to him. So he's trying to make a point here. And it's still along these lines. You need to realize who I am. You've said I'm the Son of God. It hasn't sunk in, all the implications of that. I don't owe the temple tax. But he goes on, so that we may not cause offense. Jesus isn't always opposed to offending people. But here he says, it's not the right time, not the right place. So he says, go to the lake and throw out your line. Take the first fish you catch, open its mouth, and you will find a 4-drachma coin. Take it and give it to them for my tax and yours. Don't we wish it was that easy? Well, we'd all be heading out to the lake. Wouldn't we? Tax time, let's go fishing. They don't know, obviously, there's, anytime there's a Bible story like this, there's all kinds of traditions and rumors that creep up. And apparently, as I was reading, the tilapia is called St. Peter's fish. They say, tradition has said the fish was a tilapia. So next time you eat tilapia, maybe open it up, check and see if there's a coin there. So you got this passage here, Matthew 17. It follows right after, 6 days after, Jesus saying, Peter saying, you're the Son of God. Jesus saying, I'm going to Jerusalem to die. And Peter, no way, it can't happen. Well, here you have God appear to them. And in my mind, it's like a divine rebuke. You got it wrong. And then you see what happens with the disciples. It's the result. Something's wrong. Here's the problem, and it addresses it. And it's a problem with faith. And again, this question today, what is the real problem when it comes to faith? What is the real problem? I want to know. So that, I'm not in that same place they were, being rebuked by God. And certainly I'm not missing out on the power that could happen. What's the real problem with faith? Well, few key ideas. The first one is I believe there is a problem with our faith. Let's recognize that up front. I believe there is a problem. You look at the disciples, there definitely was. They had been granted power. It said in Matthew 10:8, when Jesus sent them out, he says, you can heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse those who have leprosy, and drive out demons. That's the power they were given. And we have no reason to think they didn't do those things. You can't get much more powerful than raising the dead. They had this power from Jesus. But then you look at verses 15 to 16 here. The man says to Jesus, Lord, have mercy on my son. He has seizures and is suffering greatly. He often falls into the fire or into the water. I brought him to your disciples, but they could not heal him. They couldn't heal him. What's up? And notice, even they wonder, because they say, why couldn't we drive it out, Jesus? It wasn't some obvious answer that, again, we see why this one's more difficult. We see why it's different. What's up, Jesus? We could do this and now we can't. What's the problem? When you think about us, and this, what about us and the power of God? Is there a problem when it comes to us experiencing God's power? I think there is. Let me say this, and I don't have a long time to talk about miracles. If you want to talk about them later, the miracles of someone just laying their hand on someone and instantly being healed, instantly coming back to life, whatever it was, I believe those had a specific purpose, and because of that, a specific duration. And the Bible makes it clear. John's whole gospel is, I'm going to tell you about the miracles Jesus did so you'll believe who he was. He was the Son of God. It's the same thing for these spokesmen. They get up to say, I've got a message from Jesus. How do we know? How do we know? They do a miracle, a true lay their hand on someone miracle. And that was the purpose, to credential the messenger and the message. And before these people had the New Testament, someone would stand up in a church that was far off. They hadn't gotten any of the letters yet. And God would give a prophecy. Well, how do you know it was from God? Because someone else would stand up and heal someone and say, yeah, that's God's way of saying, yeah, that message is right. It's real. Well, once we got the Bible, we didn't need that anymore. Now, follow that up every time I say it immediately with that doesn't mean I don't believe God works powerfully. Even miraculously, if you want to, depending on how you define that. But I don't think someone has the ability to just touch someone and instantly, completely, automatically, every time that person is healed. I think that gift has ended. And again, if you want to talk to me more about that, we can. But let me say this, God's presence and power was always to continue. Matthew, look on your handout, chapter 28, 19 and 20 says, "Therefore go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And surely I am with you always to the very end of the age." Jesus says, I'm going to be with you. And do you think he's going to be with us just like looking on silently? Like, I'm not going to do anything, but I'll be with you. No. And so would anyone say that we're fully experiencing the presence and power of God, of Jesus? I mean, can you really look at the church as a whole, or can you look at any person, and certainly ourselves included, and say, you know what? I am fully experiencing the presence of Christ and his power. Absolutely. I've got it. I don't think so. And you know what? Excluding the direct miracles, lay your hand on someone and raise them from the dead, it actually lowers the bar. I mean, if I were to say that, who's raised someone from the dead this week? Someone from the, if she's really sleepy, that doesn't count. You know, it's like, okay, if you haven't raised someone from the dead, what's up, you losers? Come on, we're supposed to be doing this. No, take that off the table. We're not even expected to do that. Okay, the bar's just really come down, hasn't it? I'm still not meeting the bar, I don't think. I still don't look at my life and say, yeah, since you got raised the dead off there, I feel pretty comfortable now with I'm experiencing all the presence and power of Christ. I still don't think so. I still don't think it's there. Well, would anyone say then that the problem is God or Jesus? Like, what's up, Jesus? You promised. Where you been? You taking a vacation this century? The problem's not God. The problem's not Jesus. The problem's with us. What is the problem? Well, what was the disciples' problem? Remember what Jesus said? It's your faith. It is something about your faith. And I think it's the same thing. Again, 2 Corinthians, I've quoted this verse over and over, but I think it's key, for we live by faith, not by sight. That is the foundation of the Christian life. It's the dynamic we're supposed to be living in. It's how we experience this power. There is something about our faith. And even if you were to say, well, I think the reason some of us aren't is, we're not really as obedient as we should be. You know what? Even obedience falls under faith. We're faced with these choices. Do I obey God's principle or not? I just don't trust God that if I obey your principle, it's going to turn out best. I think I'm going to get in a tough situation. I think it's going to be, I'm going to pass this time, Jesus. I don't trust you. So even lack of obedience is a lack of faith. That's our issue. There is a problem with our faith. The second thing we need to realize, though, the problem is not the amount or the size of our faith. And you might say, but Steve, look what it said right there. Truly, I tell you, if you have faith as small as a mustard seed. Jesus said, to start off, because you have so little faith. They say, why couldn't we cast this demon out? Because you have so little faith. It sounds like it's the size, doesn't it? It sounds like it's the amount of their faith. But then Jesus says, truly I tell you, if you have faith as small as a mustard seed. Do you know how big a mustard seed is? You know how big a mustard seed is? I happen to have some mustard seeds. Charlie's going to pass some out over there. Or she's going to go that way. Oh, I was going to send you on that side. There, take a little handful and pass some of those around. Charlie will get you there. She's going that way now. You can never tell where Charlie's going. There you go. That's a mustard seed. Oh, will you give one to Grace there, Darren? You guys ever had a mustard seed? There you go. That is a mustard seed. Yeah, be careful. They're probably gone already. See how small that is? Do you really think Jesus is saying, listen, guys, this is how much faith you need. Peter, James, John, you guys are at the top of the group because you've got half a mustard seed. And the rest of you, you're not even at half a mustard. If you just had this much, you'd be able to. You don't have this much faith. No. That's not the point Jesus is making here. You know, in his mind, in that world, this was something you didn't divide. People didn't like, oh, I'll give you half a mustard seed. Like, no, it was like an indivisible unit. It was their atom at the time, you know, and even now we know atoms can be divided. It was that smallest unit. He wanted to make the point, it's something small, but it's not something like you have half and then no. Basically, when it comes to a mustard seed, you've either got it or you don't. No one had half a mustard seed. Someone's been eating it. I see people like picking your teeth. Yeah, yeah. It's a little spicy. Well, I've got a whole little jar up here, so you can have them when you're done. I know, you can have it, and we'll go from there. And here's the thing to think about. The disciples had been able to cast out demons before. They'd been able to raise the dead before. That means that they had a mustard seed of faith. Did it shrink? Did they lose some of it? Did it break in? What happened? It's not the size of the faith. The point Jesus is making. If you have any faith, you've got that amount. That's what he's using for their culture. This is the smallest indivisible thing I can think of, a mustard seed. You've got it or you don't. It's not about being bigger. Do you notice anything missing from Matthew's account of the story? Have you heard this story before, that the father and the son couldn't heal him? You notice something missing? I put it on the handout there. Mark, he adds some other details that Matthew left out. Jesus asked, Mark 9, 21, 24, Jesus asked the boy's father, how long has he been like this? From childhood, he answered, it is often the demon thrown him into the fire or water to kill him. But if you can do anything, take pity on us and help us. If you can, Jesus said, and I love that. If you can. And Jesus, I don't think he's, trying to be rude to the man, because he understands. Well, this guy came to the disciples. They've been able to heal people. Now they can't. He has a legitimate reason. But Jesus says, if you can, everything is possible for the one who believes. Immediately the boy's father exclaimed, I do believe. Help me overcome my unbelief. Matthew leaves that out. That seems pretty important. That's always been a part of that I've focused on. And Matthew says, no, that's not what I'm talking about. Matthew's not talking about belief. Bless you. Want some mustard? Matthew's not talking about belief. He's talking about faith. And here's what you need to realize. Belief and faith in the Bible, they aren't always contrasted. In John, when he talks about, I wrote these things so you may believe, he's including the whole package. Believe and the implications, the step of faith that is part of it. But there are times when the Bible sort of breaks them up. James definitely, even the demons believe. Demons don't have faith. They follow through on none of it. But they believe the fact there is a God, Jesus, they got it. Well, that's the thing here. The amount, the size of our faith, when we think about that corresponds to belief. How much belief do I have? And basically, that's not the focus. That's not the problem. Because you look here at the Mark passage, the man says, I believe, help my unbelief. And what happened to the son? He's healed. Jesus didn't say, well, that's not enough. That's not a mustard seed. I believe. Come on, you get a mustard seed, I'll heal your son. No. Any faith. I believe, help my unbelief. He had that mustard seed of belief. If you talk about that, he had the right size of belief. And Jesus saying that doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter how much you believe. If you believe something, the issue is something else. And we think about us. Is belief our problem at all? I'm tempted to say no. I mean, if we don't believe, that's one thing. But if we believe at all, God is power. Because I look at this man and his son. Again, his son was healed even though he admits, I believe, help my unbelief. It's not all the way there. The bigger problem isn't belief in God's ability to do something, it's faith. And faith encompasses something else. Faith, as we've been saying, is that idea, it's the implications. I believe, therefore I take this step of faith. I rely on God because he's the creator. I surrender to God because he's the creator. And that's what we're seeing here. Well, if the problem's not the amount of faith, then what is it? When it says so little faith there, Jesus says, to the disciples, why couldn't we heal him? He says, because you have so little faith. The other way that word can be translated, the other thing it can mean, it's not a size issue. It can be poor faith. Because you have such poor faith. And he's not talking about the quantity. He's not saying you have half a mustard seed and you need a full mustard seed. He's saying your mustard seed is rotten. Your mustard seed is bad. All the faith you have, it's not the right. There's something missing in it. You may have all this faith, but there's something missing about it. And that's the next thing. The problem is the object and nature of our faith. It's not the size of our faith. It's what our faith is in, the object, and it's the nature of our faith. Here's what I mean. Why is the transfiguration here in this part of the Bible? As we try to interpret things, remember, that's the question to ask. Why did this happen here? And Matthew tells us it really happened. God made it happen 6 days later, but why? What's it come after and what's it come before? Well, remember, it comes after Peter saying, Jesus, you are the Son of the living God. And then when Jesus says, I'm going to Jerusalem to die, Peter says, no way. You're wrong, Jesus. You're God, but you're wrong. And I'm right. I know more than you do. So he had faith, but the object, and even the object of his faith was right. It was the Son of God, but boy, there was something missing in his conception of the Son of God, wasn't there? And then what happened 6 days later? The transfiguration. Jesus was transfigured before him. His face shone like the sun. His clothes became as white as the light. God speaks. They're terrified. Do you see the implication there? Peter had this idea, I believe you're the Son of God, but you know what? You're also Jesus. You're this guy we've been palling around with. You're this guy who stubbed his toe the other day, and just like the rest of us, you're the guy that, gets a little tired when he's hungry, and you're the Son of God, but his conception of the Son of God is sorely lacking. And that's what the transfiguration is all about. God is saying, I want to remind you who I am. And I want to make it clear, if he's my son, if there's some special connection, this is what it looks like. This is what it means. You fall down in terror. You don't say you're the Son of God and then yeah, but I don't have to agree with you. The object of your faith is lacking. And so the transfiguration is all about letting these people know, this guy Jesus you've been palling around with for so long, I know you don't see it every day. He is God in the flesh. And then it's not just the object. Because the object of their faith was lacking, was distorted, the nature of their faith. Again, our faith is supposed to be reliance and surrender on God. Surrender to God. Were they surrendered at all? No. Jesus says, I'm going to Jerusalem to die, and Peter says, no, you aren't. Can you get more unsurrendered? God says one thing, and I absolutely reject it. I refuse. And so what does God do? God appears and said, this is my son. Just want to remind you the connection here. Whom I love. This isn't just some business arrangement. We have this relationship. Me and this person you're with. He's my son. I'm well pleased with him. Well pleased with what? I'm well pleased with the things he's been saying. That he's the Messiah and he's going to Jerusalem and die. Yeah, thumbs up. He's right. You're wrong. And even Moses and Elijah appearing. What's the significance of that? They don't correct Jesus. We don't know what they said, but they obviously didn't say to Jesus, hey, I wrote this law that you're quoting. You're wrong. Elijah, I'm one of the ones who prophesied. Come on, Jesus, you're missing the point. No, they're right there. They don't correct Jesus. And how does God end? What does he add this time that he didn't add at the baptism? Listen to him. You didn't listen to him before. You acknowledged he's my son, and then you rejected what he said. That won't work. That's unacceptable. The object and the nature, it wasn't faith. And again, it wasn't a quantity issue. It's like you don't have enough faith. Your faith is bad. It's not in the true God. It's not surrendered. And then it precedes the disciples. What happens? The disciples are unable to heal this boy because of their poor faith. Again, what changed? These guys could cast out demons, they could heal the sick, and they could raise the dead. What changed? This is the first time they've tried to work a miracle since Jesus said, I'm going to Jerusalem and die. And Peter, speaking for the group, said, no, you're not. We reject that. They were thinking the same thing. See, it wasn't the size of their belief. It wasn't that their belief in God's power had changed and their belief in their ability had changed. But Jesus had made a new revelation. He said, I am the Messiah. You got that, Son of God. You don't have to fully understand it. That's fine. Steve Vinson doesn't 2,000 years later either, but it's okay. You'll never get the Trinity. But you got a seed of it. But then when Jesus says, I'm going to Jerusalem to die, they're like, no, it's not just we're unaware of it. It was crystal clear. We reject it. We refuse to believe that. And so again, the object of their faith. If they're able to reject what Jesus says, they don't get really what it means he's the Son of God. They're not surrendered to him. And so they have no surrender. They have no power. They can't do something that's even lower, less than they've done before. They've raised people from the dead. They can't cast out a demon. And what's the connection of the temple tax account? It's that same thing. Like, okay, whose house is the temple? It's God's. Jesus is his son. Did God charge his son a tax? No. Get it through your heads what it means when you say I'm the Son of God. You said it, but you're not getting what it means. I'm above this tax. Now, I'll pay it so we don't cause any problems here because I've got enough problems coming. But just realize, I don't owe this tax. Well, the same thing about us. Let's try to make this personal and practical. I'm not saying our level of belief and unbelief, the size of our faith isn't a reality. But again, I look at that Father and the Son, and it's like it didn't matter that he didn't have full belief. He says, I believe, help my unbelief. But the object and nature of our faith is. Every one of us here, as far as I know, we believe there's a God. We believe in God. But what do we think about that God? Well, as we stop and think about it, who is that God? What's our conception of this God? The problem with the disciples, it wasn't that their faith was too small, it was their God was too small. And by that, maybe you've heard that. There's a book, Your God's Too Small. But it focuses on his power. It focuses on the belief side. You don't believe God's able to do these big things. That's not the thing. It's not what God can do. It's who he is. God is this creator, the sustainer of the universe. I'm his creation. It's on a whole different realm. He's up in this sphere. My conception of God is too small many times. And because of that, the nature of my faith is lacking too. Because I don't fully get who he is, I don't surrender to him. I don't just all out 100% say, God, you're God, I'm not. End of story. There is no more discussion. There is no more buts. There's no more if. None of that. And you know what? If we're not fully surrendered, then we don't fully believe. There's something lacking. We can't say, I believe that there is a creator of the universe who sustains it and sent his son to die for me, and then hold out any buts. Not be surrendered. They just don't go together, do they? It's what the disciples tried to do. It's why God appeared and said, listen to him. It's why these other disciples went to try to heal someone. And why can't we do this, Jesus? He says, well, it's because I made you aware of something you weren't aware before. And notice, they had plenty of power before they were aware of it. Before Jesus made them aware that he was going to Jerusalem to die, things were fine. But once he made them aware and they didn't accept it, then there was no power. Once we become, again, to not know something's one thing, but for God to make something clear, this is who I am, this is what I want, this is what my life, my vision, my version of life for you is, and to say, no, God, I don't like that, that's unacceptable to God. And so we need to stop and think about, okay, am I in that boat? Does this apply to me? How is that? And I look at, what's the root problem today? And I think it's either I'm not aware that my version of God is lacking. Do I believe in God? Is he all powerful? Yeah, check. Omniscient, omnipotent. What's that other one? Omnipresent. Yeah, I've got all the omnis. I'm good. But somehow we don't realize our version of God is lacking. It reminded me when I started at Scottsdale Christian Church, they had a policy and still do. Some churches do, some don't. When I started, I automatically became an elder just because I was now the lead minister. And at that point, we still had a board. Fortunately, I don't know if any of you were there in the Borg stage. Borg's sort of like Borg in the Star Trek. It's not a good thing. Elaine was there forgot her. She was there before any of us, so she knew the board. This church board, and somehow, I forget what the discussion was, but it got on something and talking about, the elders, maybe this and that, and it came up, and Steve's an elder, and he says this, and one of the women raised her hand, like, is he a real elder? He became an elder automatically. These other guys have been here all these years, and she's like, is he a real elder? Like, I know he's an elder, but. And I thought sometimes we have that version of God. God, I know you're God, but do we really know what it means that he's God, fully God? Maybe we're unaware of who God is, or maybe we're unaware our surrender's lacking. If you were to ask me, am I surrendered to God? Absolutely. And I just don't even know I'm not. Or maybe the root problem is it's starting to become apparent, and I realize I'm not surrendered, and I'm not ready to be. In my mind, I'm not ready to give up this thing, whatever it is. And so the key to overcoming those root problems of either I don't know, I don't know, or I don't care, well, it's just what we saw in the Transfiguration. It's this experience of worship. It's becoming aware of who God is. We cannot be aware that God is this amazing, again, creator, sustainer, redeemer, and have any buts. God, that's who you are. I fully know it, but no, there is none. And the more I worship him, the more I become aware of who he is and what it means, that's what's going to change that. And so the last thing today, what do I need to do? What do I need to do? Well, I need to realize where God's version of the truth is different than mine. Discipleship is radical transformation. Radical transformation of our version of life, not an improvement of it. And I think so many of us, it's hard to get over that. I want Jesus to come into my life and improve the way I'd like things to be, because he's got all this power. I need to realize where God's version of truth is different than mine. And then the second part that we're seeing, especially today in Matthew, I need to accept and to surrender to God's version of truth. Does that mean I'll live a perfect life? Absolutely not. But I can't have these parts of my life that are off limits. I can't have these buts. God, I believe you're God, but no, we've got to get rid of those. There's a definite element of rebuke in this chapter. God didn't rebuke them when they didn't know, but now that they know and they just refuse to accept, I see the transfiguration as some rebuke. That's why they were terrified. And definitely when these disciples can't heal, that's God's way of saying, listen, I'm not going to let you just reject things I say and go on as normal. My power is now no longer with you. Well, I tried to bring this. I realize this is a very heady subject, and so I tried to think, what's the specific? How does this apply day to day? And you know what? Maybe it applies to some certain areas as you think about it, but it's not so much a specific sin thing. It's not about lying or stealing. It's about what it talks about. It's about this faith. And, it's funny because in the text, it's so often about their focus on the physical. But you know what? It's the same thing. If your focus is on the physical and not the spiritual, it's a faith matter. Because either you're focused on the physical and you want everything physical, or you're focused on the physical and you walk by sight. I only believe it when I see it. You wait there. Both of those are a faith matter. I like to define faith as surrendered expectation. Surrendered expectation. I expect God to do something that wouldn't happen otherwise, but what it is exactly, I'm surrendered to him for. And I find that most people are on one extreme or the other. Either we struggle with surrender. Like, I totally expect God to do some awesome things. Here's what it is, God, I'll tell you. Matter of fact, you're busy. Just let me tell you what you need to do. Do you see the news story this week about the television evangelist whose private jet had gotten worn out? Now, Creflo Dollar. Bad name, I guess good name for a televangelist. Dollar. Yeah, he had an old jet, like 25 years old or something, and they had an engine problem, and he says, my ministry needs a new jet. And the one that he picked out that he wanted was a $65 million Gulfstream jet. And he has 200,000 people in his mailing list or whatever. He says, if you all will just give $300 each, that's $60 million. Somehow he'd find the other five, I don't know, and he was going to buy this jet. Well, it got out on the news, like CNN, all these places, and he got lambasted by people. It was, like, to say you need a jet, okay, I don't know. But to say you need this jet, there's only like 114, they're so luxurious. To say you need that jet to do God's work, no. He had some great expectations. Like, well, his expectations were off the chart. They weren't surrendered. But you know what? Then I've seen other people, and I've been in even more churches, at least my experience, that there's no expectation. Well, if God provides, then we'll take this step. If we see how he's going to, then we'll do it. But boy, if we don't see something, we're standing pat. Even with I've been in churches with a big savings account. No. We got to keep that for a rainy day. Like, God controls the rain, okay? And I think really this is the problem. We've got to find that balance of surrendered expectation. And God's revealing it to us, I believe. He wants us to see as we worship him, this is who he is. This is what he wants to do in our lives. And it is a tough balance of having expectation and being surrendered. Because once you start thinking, wow, God is powerful and he wants to work in my life, there's that part of us that says, oh, here's what I'd like you to do, God. Here's what I'd like you to do. And it's not too far from what I'd like to a $65 million jet, maybe. But there's also that other extreme of, God, I'm not going to take a step until I absolutely know. And God says, that's not honoring me either. I realize that guy makes me mad, but you make me sad if you won't honor me. All right, well, what's it going to look like when we do it? I'm convinced this is where God is leading us as a church, as individuals. He wants us to experience that balance of surrendered faith. What's it going to look like? It's what Jesus told his disciples. Truly I tell you, if you have faith as small as a mustard seed, you can say to this mountain, move from here to there, and it will move. Nothing will be impossible for you. Wouldn't you like to have that kind of life? Again, nothing God wants to see happen in my life, nothing God wants to see happen in this church won't happen because we have faith. Not just belief that I know God can do it, but this faith, this surrendered expectation, which expectation is really the reliance and surrender. I expect God. I rely on him and his power, but at the same time I'm surrendered to whatever it is. And boy, it's a tough balance, but God, I want to walk that line for you and experience your power. I want mountains to move in my life. The mountains you want to move, God. And I want to be okay with the mountains you don't want to move until you want to move them. Help me get there, God. And that's where we end today. And I'll ask you, I put a question there, start to live it out. What would it look like to consistently live a life like that? What would it look like to consistently live a life of surrendered expectation? That I truly do expect God to work every day in some way. This day is going to be different. Why? Because there is a God. I believe that. And I don't know exactly what it's going to be. I'm surrendered to that, whatever he does. But I know this day is going to be different because of him. In whatever way he wants, I'm open to bringing that about. What's that look like?